The intensification of the conflict between Israelis and Hamas expanded for years after the terrorist attack on October 7, 2023. This caused a worldwide commotion with various protests and actions, such as the organization of a flotilla to break the blockade imposed by the Israel Defense Forces. But many participants in this flotilla, coming from countries like Brazil and Turkey, seem more interested in solving the problem in the Middle East than in their own countries, taking advantage of broad engagement on social media, something they wouldn't achieve with other causes. Around 50 vessels set course for Gaza in mid-2025. They crossed the Mediterranean until they were stopped by the Israelis at the beginning of October 2025. A few days before October 7, a significant date when Hamas led one of the most successful terrorist attacks in history. On that day, Hamas attacked Israeli soldiers' bases, but there was also a massacre of civilians. With the terrorist attack, the Israelis were attacked by more than 1 million soldiers, but also by 1 million soldiers. Israelis were attacked by more than 1 million terrorists. The Israelis attacked by 1 million soldiers, but also 1 million soldiers, but more than 1 million soldiers. The men of Hamas killed when they had the opportunity, like when they saw a father and daughter trying to escape and shot at them, forcing the father to protect the child with his body. And then they simply left while a child wandered the streets, not understanding that terror. They surrounded terrified people and threw grenades, trying to kill all the unarmed civilians inside. They shot at houses, killing civilians who were still unaware of the terror happening outside. Some bodies were taken to Gaza, twisted in the back of pickup trucks, where they were spat on and desecrated by men who celebrated the deaths. There were children, elderly people, men and women killed in what the members of the flotilla called a resistance movement. Even rapes and sexual assaults that some Israeli women suffered were called resistance, or simply denied, going against what so many women's protection movements claimed about believing the woman's word in this situation. And there were even those who said that Hamas was peaceful, that Hamas never wanted to commit violent acts and was simply resisting, that there was nothing in its current constitution that would lead to this kind of violence. At this barbaric level that the Hamas members themselves posted, with some of them, the members calling their parents to celebrate having killed unarmed civilians with their own hands.
Dad, I killed 10. 10! With my own
After
hands!
that, Hamas took off their uniforms and blended in with the population in Gaza, camouflaging themselves among civilians while the Israelis invaded Palestinian territory. From civilian areas, Hamas fired their rockets at Israeli cities while they still had the opportunity. That's when a war began that would last for the next several years. Israeli tanks entered Gaza. The airstrikes came soon after. The destruction began to increase as the war against Hamas started and the hostages were being sought. Without the uniforms worn on October 7th, dressed as civilians, Hamas walked through the rubble to attack the Israelis. GLI. Of course, this helped spread the lie, saying that Hamas was fighting the Israelis with sticks and stones, something from people who deliberately ignored Hamas's multi-million-dollar funding. The money spent on tunnels, logistics, and their training camps. Historically, Hamas obtained resources by charging high import fees and taxes on the population of the Gaza Strip. In addition, they rely on financial contributions of millions of dollars from capital. The Izz al-Din al-Qassam brigades, Eng, the military wing of the movement that had an independent financial system, ING, received their main support from Iran. In addition, a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamic organization based in Egypt, stated that approximately 10% of the group's budget was also allocated to Hamas. At the beginning of the battles, there was still strong support for the Israeli offensive. Although there were demonstrations in favor of Hamas, public opinion began to change over time. The horrors of war began to appear after the bombings as the number of victims became increasingly abundant. At certain times, even when they target important Hamas leaders, the Israelis hit many civilians. One example was Mohammed Simar, who was targeted by an Israeli attack on a bunker under the European hospital in Gaza in Khan Yunis. The bombs killed another 26 innocent people. An unsuspecting person might blame only Hamas for using a tunnel under a hospital as a bunker, but it's the responsibility of the Israelis to choose to attack and destroy lives as well, lives that often didn't even know who was beneath them. Many of these people were simply hostages of a regime like that. Something similar happened to Mohammed Difi, one of the most famous leaders of Hamas, who was attacked in Khan Yunis with a bombing in which at least 90 Palestinians were killed and more than 300 were injured. In other absurd cases like the bombing of the World Central Kitchen convoy, 7 people providing humanitarian aid were killed. This is not to mention other damage and deaths caused by bombings or even the demolition of several buildings. The very fact that the Israel Defense Forces brought down so many buildings was in itself a crime. Even if Hamas used those places, it showed that there was no plan to properly deal with so many displaced Palestinians. The hunger caused by the war began to spread through parts of Gaza to the point where desperate people tried to get food by attacking humanitarian aid convoys. In more than one case, there were riots and shootings, and Israeli soldiers were held responsible for shooting at the starving civilians. It was not easy to provide assistance to desperate and starving people. Hamas had its share of blame, but that does not absolve the Israelis. And it was even foolishness if a flotilla of inexperienced individuals thought they could help with just a little food and try to contain desperate crowds. Hunger and despair change a human being. But groups like these serve through social media, doing their propaganda and getting their likes, using the tragedy of the Palestinians. Israel's crimes existed, of course, including the crimes of settlers invading Palestinian lands in the West Bank, something that has been talked about less since the tragedy of the war in Gaza. And these are crimes that cannot be forgotten. The violence, however, intensified after the election of a government in 2022, which proposed expanding Israeli settlements in Palestinian territories. The situation worsened even further after the terrorist attack and massacre led by Hamas against Israel on October 7, 2023.
October 2024, 1 year later.
Al Jazeera reported 1,423 incidents of violence committed by settlers in the West Bank since that date. Interestingly, some members of the flotilla like to use the example of the West Bank to say that there's no Hamas there and things are bad. 2 lies. One was that Hamas did exist, although it didn't have the same power as in Gaza, and there were other armed groups. The other, a wicked lie, seemed to suggest that the situation was worse or could get worse. It was easily disproved by comparing the number of standing buildings in places where Hamas had total control and where it didn't, to see whether it was better to have Hamas as the ruler or not.
Yes, cruel. Unfortunately, a cruel truth.
It must be admitted that Hamas did, in fact, open the possibility for this war and devastation. The solutions of many people who were lost in daydreams were the worst possible. They loved the slogan "from the river to the sea," which indicated that there should be a Palestinian state stretching from the Jordan River to the sea, which would imply the destruction of Israel. And in yet another bloodbath, the more cynical one spoke of a single democratic state for everyone. A Western perspective, unable to understand the sectarianism and extremism, was present on both sides, and also foolishly or hypocritically forgetting what has already happened in distortions of democracy that led to the persecution of various peoples. And more interestingly, none of these concerns about what would happen or what it would be like to remove people from a country or entire cities. It would also be interesting to see them posting on social media, which would be considered resistance murder, rape, and kidnapping in their own country in response to the problems that existed there. So, let's talk about the first genocide, which doesn't get likes. The fleet could sail across the Atlantic and stop in Nigeria. There, humanitarian aid would be very useful against the jihadist groups persecuting Christian communities. The violence against Christians in Nigeria is fueled by at least three interconnected dimensions. The first is the ideologically motivated dimension, driven by jihadist groups like Boko Haram and the Islamic State West Africa province. These groups operate mainly in northeastern Nigeria, attacking places of worship and targeting the civilian population as part of their strategy to destabilize the state. The second dimension is the conflict over resources, especially prominent in the Middle Belt. Historically, this has been a friction zone between nomadic herders, mostly Fulani, who are Muslims, and sedentary farmers who are largely Christians. Animosity has been drastically aggravated by resource scarcity induced by climate change and the subsequent increase in competition for land and water. The third dimension is the ethnic and religious aggravating factor. Although many conflicts with the Fulani herders are triggered by land disputes, the violence is systematically targeted, resulting in massacres of Christian farmers, raising serious accusations of ethnic and religious cleansing campaigns, and genocide by local leaders and international observers. Single incidents are often catastrophic, with reports indicating up to 200 Christians killed in a single coordinated attack. The modus operandi of these attacks is characterized by high-impact massacres and coordination. For example, in Benue State, an attack carried out on Good Friday claimed the lives of at least 35 people who were in an internally displaced persons camp near a local primary school. More recently, at Christmas, coordinated attacks in Plateau State resulted in at least 160 deaths in Gaza, and the destruction of more than 200 houses, with most of the victims being women, children, and the elderly. Of course, violence in Nigeria is complex and not exclusively against Christians, as seen in the case that generated even more media attention in 2014. On the night of April 14 to 15, 2014, the extremist group Boko Haram kidnapped 276 students aged 16 to 18 from the Chibok Girls Secondary School. The school had been temporarily reopened for final exams after being closed for weeks due to security reasons. 57 girls managed to escape shortly after the kidnapping, and others were later rescued by Nigerian forces. In May 2016, Amina Ali, one of the missing girls, was found and stated that some of her classmates had died. 7 years later, more than 100 girls were still missing. In April 2024, 82 were still unaccounted for, presumably in captivity. But since then, the chaos continues. To question the fate of these girls or take further action. But Boko Haram would not welcome a flotilla that tried to bring visibility to these girls? Since this case is difficult to resolve, let's think of another destination for the flotilla, even if only to bring attention again to a tragedy already forgotten by the media. The flotilla could take advantage of the route to the Middle East and hear some stories about the Yazidis. The Yazidis are a Kurdish-speaking ethno-religious minority whose identity is deeply tied to their monotheistic faith. They originate from Kurdistan, a region that covers parts of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. Small communities also live in Armenia and Georgia. Throughout history, the Yazidis have been the target of systematic persecution, marked by repeated episodes of violence and attempts at extermination, known internally as ferments. After the first Muslim conquests, the Yazidis began to be accused of heresy and suffered severe persecution. Between the 18th and 19th centuries, 72 genocidal massacres took place, many of them with the approval of state authorities. Despite this, at the end of the Ottoman Empire, coexistence between Yazidis and their Muslim neighbors became more peaceful for a period. In the contemporary era, however, the group once again became the target of persecution, especially during the attack by the Islamic State between 2014 and 2017, an episode known as the Yazidi Genocide. In this campaign, thousands of men were executed while women and girls were enslaved, raped, and forced to convert to Islam. It is estimated that the Islamic State killed about 5,000 Yazidis and trafficked approximately 10,800 women and girls throughout Iraq. The humanitarian consequences were devastating. More than 500,000 people were displaced from their lands, taking refuge mainly in camps in the Kurdistan region. To this day, due to insecurity and the continued presence of armed groups, more than 100,000 Yazidis remain displaced, unable to return to their homes in Sinjar. Since Kurdistan was mentioned, it's worth highlighting a point, which might be relevant for a Turkish participant in the flotilla. Maybe he wouldn't even need to leave his own country to fight for the rights of a people. It would be, at the very least, consistent to start by defending the recognition by Turkey of the Armenian genocide, an episode still denied by the Turkish state. From the late 19th to early 20th century, Armenians were targeted in large-scale massacres. On April 24, 1915, Ottoman authorities arrested and deported hundreds of Armenian intellectuals and leaders under the orders of Talat Pasha. Between 800,000 and 1.2 million Armenians were forced to march to the Syrian desert, deprived of food and water, and victims of rape, looting, and murder. The survivors were confirmed, rounded up in concentration camps, and in 1916 a new wave of massacres reduced the number of deportees to about 200,000. In addition, between 100,000 and 200,000 women and children were forcibly converted to Islam and integrated into Muslim families. This genocide put an end to more than 2,000 years of Armenian presence in eastern Anatolia, and along with the expulsion of Assyrian and Greek Orthodox Christians, it paved the way for the creation of an ethno-nationalist Turkish state. To this day, the Turkish government insists that these deportations do not constitute a genocide. However, Armenians were not the only ones to suffer discrimination within Turkish borders. The Kurdish people also live there, one of the largest stateless nations in the world. The Kurdish movement represents one of the longest struggles for autonomy in the Middle East, mainly involving Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. In Turkey, the conflict is especially intense, marked by military and political repression under the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Since the founding of the Republic in 1923, the Kurds have faced massacres and persecution. Among the most serious episodes is the Dersim massacre. Between 40,000 and 70,000 civilians were killed, and nearly 12,000 people were exiled. To this day, The use of the Kurdish language is prohibited as a language of instruction in public and private schools, and the government uses accusations of ties to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, to justify repression against political representatives. The Kurdistan Workers' Party, in turn, has been for decades. On May 12, 2025, it announced plans for dissolution, a gesture that could have symbolized the beginning of a process of reconciliation and democratic openness. Since the 1970s, the European Court of Human Rights has already condemned Turkey for thousands of violations, including executions of civilians, torture, forced displacement, destruction of villages, arbitrary arrests, and the murder or disappearance of Kurdish journalists. Turkey would be a tough job for the flotilla, but it's a beautiful place. They would take great selfies. Sailing there would bring new visibility to the Kurds, but maybe they don't want to, since it wouldn't get as much social media engagement. The first major Jewish immigration coming from Eastern Europe and Yemen, motivated by religious and political persecution. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the abolition of slavery seemed to announce a new era, suggesting that barbarism could finally come to an end. However, the 20th century would show that violence and exploitation would remain deeply rooted in the formation of the country, often sustained by the actions or omissions of the state itself. The rubber cycle became the main driver of settlement and economic growth in the northern region, boosting the modernization of cities and villages in the Amazon. But progress came with pain and destruction from the very beginning. Urban and economic expansion was marked by a regime of violence, led by robber barons and the so-called Avidora houses, the economic system that sustained this machinery. A type of credit that provided industrial goods, food, and tools to the latex collectors, mostly indigenous people and migrants from the Northeast. In practice, however, this model turned into a brutal form of debt bondage. The rubber tappers, unable to pay off exorbitant debts, became prisoners of their bosses, subject to punishment and even death. The scale of the violence was so great that it drew international attention. Estimates indicate that to produce just 4,000 tons of rubber, about 30,000 indigenous people were killed, victims of torture, exhaustion, and massacres. In 1910, the British consul presented a report denouncing the crimes committed against indigenous populations in the tri-border region between Brazil, Peru, and Colombia, revealing to the world a true genocide. In the same year, the Brazilian government created the Indian Protection Service, a federal agency that, in theory, was supposed to guarantee the rights of indigenous peoples. In practice, however, the agency operated under an integrationist policy whose goal was to erase cultures and ways of life in the name of civilization. The irony of the name would become apparent in the following decades. While the world watched the horror of the Holocaust in Europe, Brazil was carrying out a silent genocide. In the 1940s, the Indian Protection Service itself and the Brazilian state forcibly relocated peoples such as the Aikana, Kanek, Kiwazas, and Salamais to work on rubber plantations. Many died of hunger along the way. The survivors were confined at the Ricardo Franco post, where diseases and poor living conditions nearly led to the extinction of the Kanek tribe. With the military coup of 1964, the Amazon and the Midwest became the focus of an aggressive expansion policy inspired by the doctrine of national security. Under the guise of development, the government built highways, encouraged mining, and promoted the entry of large extractive companies. This was a process that brought more invasions, epidemics, and massacres. The military regime established specific repressive structures to consolidate control over indigenous peoples. In 1969, the Indigenous Rural Guard was created, made up of indigenous people from the military police of Minas Gerais, to watch over and punish their own relatives. In the same year, the Krenak Indigenous Agricultural Reformatory was established, a punishment center disguised as a re-education project where indigenous people were imprisoned, beaten, and subjected to physical and psychological punishments. This set of policies reveals a pattern that spans decades of Brazilian history: the use of the Amazon and its peoples as a territory for exploitation, control, and violence, always in the name of progress but almost never in the name of life. In 1963, one of the worst indigenous massacres occurred, known as the Massacre of the Parallel 11. The conflict between the Sintilarga group and the rubber tappers increased until the 1960s. In 1960, the situation worsened when the Cuabo-Porto Velo Highway BR-390 was inaugurated. The Sintilarga faced threats not only from rubber tappers, but also from prospectors who sought their land for gold and diamonds. The massacre of Parallel 11 stained the headwaters of the Aripuan River with blood. The company, Arruda Junqueira and Company Limited, exploited rubber and was plotting something much darker: the extermination of the Sintilarga. Driven by ambition, he decided they should disappear, called them parasites and pests, and gave the order that would turn the forest into a killing field. A plane was hired to start the massacre. From the sky, dynamite rained down on the sleeping village. The explosions broke the dawn and spread panic among the indigenous people. But the killing didn't end there. For 68 days, an armed expedition traveled more than 2,000 kilometers with a single purpose: to destroy on solid ground. The massacre was completed at dawn when the Sintilarga were preparing for work. The machine gun burst broke the silence of the forest. Men, women, and children were mercilessly killed. A baby was taken from its mother's arms and shot at point-blank range. The woman, brutally tortured, was hanged and mutilated. When silence returned, 30 lives had been taken in that attack. Only 2 survivors managed to escape, forever carrying the memory of the horror. In total, it is estimated that around 3,500 Sintilarga were killed during that period. It was a genocide marked by the participation, or at the very least, the omission of the Brazilian state. Indigenous lives violently in Brazil. The beginning of 2023 revealed to the country one of the most serious humanitarian crises in its recent history: the situation of extreme vulnerability of the people, Yanomami, a direct result of the invasion of illegal miners on their land. This tragedy, however, did not begin that year. The presence of mining had been growing for some time. Between 2020 and 2021, illegal exploitation in the area quadrupled. Amid this scenario, decisions by the government itself worsened the problem. Between 2019 and 2023, the total number of child deaths reached 570, caused by malnutrition, hunger, and mercury contamination from mining. Even after the reports gained national and international attention, the suffering persisted. In October 2023, data from the Special Secretariat of Indigenous Health indicated that 250 Yanomami had died just that year. The most tragic thing is that this crisis was not the work of a single government. Democracy, dictatorship, left, right, all were responsible. The tragedy took shape over the course of different administrations from different parties, marked by a pattern of neglect and silence in the face of the destruction of an entire people. Apparently, few people were bothered. After 2023 that didn't generate any more likes or enough engagement on social media, it's interesting that the flip didn't move to sail through the Amazon until it reached an area of threat or faced conflict with land grabbers, illegal miners, or ranchers. It's better not to go there because they wouldn't be welcomed there with coats or with bread like the Israeli armed forces did. Of course, the food they brought, although far from making an impact in Gaza, would have a big impact on some populations in hardship in Brazil. The flotilla would also bring attention to forgotten groups. After all, people talk about Gaza at the United Nations and there are daily news reports in major outlets. Brazil, period. It would be interesting to see what the engagement of these people would be like on social media by asking Brazil to depopulate the northern region. For example, to put an end to cities like Porto Velho, whose origin is intrinsically linked to the rubber cycle and the construction of the Madeira Mamoré Railway. Or would they think it would be fair, the murder, the kidnapping and rape, or the depopulation of Vienna, cities of around 110,000 people, in the area of the massacre at Parallel 11 against the Cinta Larga? It would be interesting to see the engagement if they were promoting violence and saying that if the indigenous people did the same thing Hamas did in Israel, that would be resistance to be carried out, depopulated. But is violence really the best decision nowadays? It would also be interesting to ask them if the problems of territorial disputes between local tribes should be resolved with violence in 2024. Police managed to disperse a group of warriors from the Cinta Larga tribe who were preparing to attack a Saban village near the city of Vienna. The conflict between these tribes over territorial disputes was relatively under control, until a recent court decision that determined the demarcation of each group's areas. Should a conflict like this, which stems from decades of external interference, be resolved through violence or by the complete exclusion of a people? That's an important question. But if the flotilla doesn't know how to answer, there are other places to go. There's a lot more to talk about. For example, the flotilla could have used its boats to help the 40 Rohingya who were thrown into the sea by the Indian government and forced to swim until they reach Myanmar, a country where their ethnicity is persecuted and where they suffered a genocide that caused between 25,000 and 40,000 deaths and the displacement of more than 1 million people. Not to mention the accusations of rape, ethnic cleansing, and religious cleansing. It must have been difficult for many people to get to this part of the video, especially for those who monopolize suffering for the Palestinians, in their excuses using absurd arguments like the so-called equivalence of violence, claiming that Hamas uses sticks and stones and the Israeli armed forces do not. Well, talk about equivalence to a Yazidi woman being turned into a sex slave, to an indigenous woman, Brazilian, to the Chinese state putting the Uyghurs in re-education camps. Oops, you can't talk about the Uyghurs, because apparently the so-called re-education by the Chinese state is good for them. It must have been so good. What about the re-education that Canada did with its people, or that Brazil has done with its indigenous people? But that's how the world is. The United Nations saw Erdogan and the Turkish president speak about the massacre in Gaza, and no one left the session like they did with Netanyahu, even after everything that happened for the Kurdish state. The current president of Syria gave a speech after, in the same year, massacres against Alawites and Druze happened in his country. So, he who has already been both part of the Islamic State and has ties to Al-Qaeda. But no one left the session during his speech. But I'll end here. These genocides don't get likes or any reaction on social media. If they did, there would be more people protesting and organizing flotillas to collect food or save these people. But why is there this exclusivity for Palestine for the protests? Leave your comment. Also share this video, remembering that the goal is to show part of the international hypocrisy. That's the goal here. At no time is it about erasing or downplaying the crimes committed by the Netanyahu government in Gaza, and even less about erasing what Hamas did in Israel. Just remember one thing: the normal state of geopolitics is hypocrisy, and groups like this flotilla are no exception.